What we're trying to do is to help you to appreciate the intricacies, the complexities of the science, to celebrate creation and enjoy it, but then also to think about these questions of meaning and purpose that science can raise.
Is the universe as a whole full of purpose? Of course it is. And that's why we think it is, because in a sense we are resonating with this deep instinct that things are not simply random.
When I look at some of the things that I study in science, I never cease to be amazed at quite how impressive the world is.
Christian scripture describes God's creation as good, and as each of the different components as God creates them being deemed good. And I think that's indicative of the natural tendency I feel I have to ascribe intrinsic value to creatures.
The natural world, as I've come to understand it more, in my view, is a reflection of the goodness and the wisdom of its creator.
The genetic code is clearly very special. It's what we mean by special, right down to this fact that it has curious, deep properties that seem to be more or less predictable.
There's a series of interconnections between God, humanity, and the rest of creation that are playing out all the time. And in an ideal world, those connections work really well, and the land flourishes, people flourish.
And one of the things that excites me about Christianity is it's a lens that brings my experience, my observations of the world into far sharper focus than anything else I've discovered up to this point. We need that clarity. We need that sense of being able to see things properly.
For me, studying the wonders of a living world is an exercise in art appreciation. So for me, the joy of discovery is also the joy of appreciating the world that God has made.
Christians in Science is a network of people interested in the relationship between science and faith.
Our members include research scientists in universities,
engineers, theologians and philosophers,
as well as students, school teachers, administrators,
and anyone interested in science and faith issues.
CIS members receive access to the Science and Christian Belief Journal,
monthly email updates, and a quarterly newsletter.
You can also receive discounted tickets to our conferences and events throughout the year.
Our CIS local groups provide the opportunity to meet, listen,
and discuss science and faith issues with other CIS members on a regular basis.
As a full-time student, you receive your first year membership for free.
And discounted rates for the remainder of the course.
These discounts continue for the first 4 years after your first degree.
If you recognise that the work of CIS is important,
and would like to support us without becoming a member,
you can join us as a friend of CIS.
I am a member because CIS is a great community where you can get support, encouragement, and also challenge, which I think is important.
I'm a member of CIS because I'm passionate about both science and my Christian faith.
I am a member because I want to support the work that CIS does.
I'm a member of Christians in Science because I value the teaching, the learning, the thinking, the analysing opportunities that I've had throughout these years.
I am a member because I value the community and support that comes from being a part of CIS.
I first came across CIS as an undergraduate, and since then as a PhD student, postdoc, and now as a lecturer across 3 different universities, I've always managed to find a local CIS group to get involved with.
I'm a member because I enjoy chatting with people who are also interested in this topic, be it in a breakout room at a conference or simply while meeting up for a cup of tea.
To learn more or sign up, please visit our website.
Good morning and welcome to day 2 of our Northern Conference, Digital Theology and the Church. I'm Peter Budd. I'm a professor of polymer chemistry at the University of Manchester and a reader in the Church of England, and I'm your host for this morning. Yesterday evening, we got off to a fantastic start with our keynote lecture, Brains, Mind and AI, with one of the pioneers of personal computing, Steve Ferber. Today we have a lineup of 5 exciting looking talks, and we hope that you're going to enjoy everything that happens today. Certainly in my part of Greater Manchester, the weather outside is exceedingly gloomy, so it's a good day to have a scintillating conference to get involved with. Each of the talks has its own YouTube link, so we will try to finish about 1:45 the hour, so there's time for you to have a quick break and link into the next talk. If you're on YouTube, then you can connect and interact using the chat function, ask questions as you think of them, and you'll also be able to ask questions in the Q&A after the talk. And you can also ask questions by emailing steph.cis@outlook.com. If you're into social media, then you can use the hashtag CISNC2021. So our first talk is entitled Too Much Information. And that's also the title of a book by our first speaker, Andrew Graystone. Andrew is someone who's had a lot of interaction with the media. He was a producer for the BBC, and he has featured in many talks on various BBC channels. And he also had an image go viral when, after the bombing of a mosque in Christchurch, New Zealand, he stood outside a mosque in the Levenshulme district of Manchester with a handwritten sign that said, "You are my friends, I will keep watch while you pray." Well, it's great to have Andrew joining us today to pick up that theme of too much information. He has another new book out. I'm sure he'll say something about that too. But can I just welcome now Andrew Graystone.
Thank you so much, Peter. It's lovely to be with you today. Thank you. We were, of course, planning to meet in person this time last year, and here we are amazingly able to meet via the internet, but not in person. And in many ways, the question I'm struggling with this morning is, what difference does it make that we're not meeting in the same room or at the same time? Is it just the same, or does it make a real difference? My sister-in-law was given Alexa for Christmas. You'll know about Alexa. We played with it all Boxing Day afternoon. Alexa, choose some Christmas music for me. Alexa, what's the weather like in Birmingham? Alexa, what's the traffic like on the M6? Alexa, tell us a joke. And she, or rather it, responded appropriately and accurately every time. But I'm not a psychologist, I'm a theologian. So I started getting smart with Alexa. Alexa, what's the meaning of life? There was a pause and she said, 42. Alexa, do you believe in God? I'm not equipped to answer that question, she said. And then I tried, Alexa, are you happy? I'm sorry, I don't understand your question. Alexa, would you like to have a body? I'm sorry, I don't understand your... So now Alexa is just a household toy. Supposing we could build an Alexa that could store all of human knowledge in one place. Be good at making decisions, would never make mistakes or get tired or angry. That could be extremely useful. And supposing we could program this machine so that it would learn by itself. In other words, we could equip it with algorithms that would find patterns and generate insights from raw data. Once these algorithms had collected enough data and compiled a big enough library of causes and effects, could use this information to make decisions and predictions when it found itself in a similar situation. it could then have an artificial instinct that would be more predictable and more accurate than ours. So, for instance, it could probably diagnose illnesses that your local hospital consultant has never come across. It could provide legal advice more accurately than any expensive barrister. We already have a computer program that can collect more information than all the world's libraries put together. And then we program our computer to make decisions in situations it hasn't come across before, but based on what it's learned in situations that it has come across before. That machine would in some senses be equal to us, or even in some senses maybe superior to us. My question is, if we built such a thing, how should we treat it? Would it be right to call it intelligent? Should we think of it as conscious, because it would behave pretty much like a conscious human being, and much more so than an animal? Would it be capable of pain or joy? Would it be okay to treat it as a servant? Or given that it was smarter than us, would it deserve the same legal rights and personal dignities that we give to humans? Now, before I come on to that, I want to make 3 brief observations about the nature of this discussion. And the first is this: technology changes us. Whether or not we choose to engage with it, technology changes us. American cultural theorist Marshall McLuhan described the transformational impact of every new technology on the nature of human relationships. When we use tools of any kind, he said, we're engaging in an imaginative process to shape the world around us, but it's not neutral. As we use tools to shape the world, we are in turn forced to respond to the transformation by changing ourselves. The technology makes its own impact. If you dig a garden with a spade, the spade has an impact on you as a person, as well as on the garden you're digging. Jaron Lanier, who's a brilliant technologist who, amongst other things, developed the MP3 system, gives a stark warning about the ways that technology acts on us. When we're presented with a new technology, we tend to adapt ourselves to accommodate it. If all you've got is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. And if all you've got is a computer, however big, every problem looks like a computation. Machines are appearing to be more and more intelligent, Lanier says, because humans are choosing to abase ourselves in front of them. Did Alexa really know the answers to our questions? Or were we just playing along, playing dumb, asking the questions that we knew Alexa could answer to make Alexa seem clever? So that's the first observation: technology changes us. And my second is this: culture matters more than technology. It's not what's happening in technology that's fundamentally important, but what's happening in our culture. Great many discussions in this area focus on advances in digital technology, and of course they're dizzying. I've been to more than enough conferences where the speakers speculated on what technology is going to be available in 5, 10, 50 years from now. And sometimes they were right and sometimes not. Often it felt like the speakers were trying to bamboozle us or even frighten us. And it's easy to be awed or frightened by technology. It used to be talking fridges and intelligent clothes. Today it's Alexa and driverless cars and sex robots. Recently, I went to the International Congress on Love and Sex with Robots. I know, I went so you didn't have to. It was full of academics talking about synthesized skin, virtual orgasms, teledildonics, and such like. But the things I took away from it were different. First, that we can't agree on what we mean by a robot. Second, we don't know what we mean by sex. And no sex robots currently exist in the form that Channel 5 will show them to you. It's quite unlikely that we will be able to create one. And if we did, we're pretty sure not many people would want one. But what was really important was not all the fascinating technology that's being built or imagined, but how living in digital culture is changing us. Infrastructure of life's increasingly autonomous. So many decisions not made by a human, but by the systems themselves. You search for a restaurant, the recommendation isn't made by a human, but by an algorithm. Financial decisions, the same. I don't just mean city investments, but your request for a loan. My grandfather used to go in, sit with his bank manager and plead for a loan. That's way in the past, as we know. Even my 90-year-old mother, who's never owned a computer herself, is known and remembered and processed by countless systems every day of which she is unaware. Now, in all these kind of ways, we humans project ourselves into the world in ways that are disembodied. We can have any number of disembodied personae, some of which we're in control of and some of them we're hardly aware of. And my multiple projected personae can have all sorts of different characteristics that don't necessarily relate to the flesh and blood person who's sitting in Manchester this morning. When I was on Second Life, which some of you will know, my avatar on Second Life was 6'2" and muscle bound. Now, my third reflection is that this is not a digital revolution. Some people like to suggest that we're living through a digital revolution, but I don't find that language helpful, because revolution suggests that everything has changed. It hasn't. It's less than 40 years since the internet became commercially available for non-military users. And now more than half of the entire population of the world has access. 4.9 billion people at the moment have a mobile phone contract. That's more people than have a flushing toilet. It's true that the arrival of digital technology has been hugely disruptive. And it's true that the rate of change in technology has been dizzyingly fast. But for all that the rate of change is increasing, the impact of digital culture is essentially continuous with much of what went before. The rate may have changed. A digital hammer can strike harder by some orders of magnitude than an analog hammer. But lots of fundamental things are simply developments of what went before. People who are powerful in analog culture are still more powerful in digital culture. People who were disadvantaged before are even more disadvantaged now, and so on. Now, I want to think with you about some of the features of being human in a digital age. There's so many things we could look at, but I'm going to focus on just one core feature of digital transmission, which is the stripping out of context from the information that we send and receive and use. It's often referred to as the collapse of context. Let me just illustrate this. Information that's held in a physical object, like a book, will change over the course of time. The text will stay the same, but the object itself gathers new information, a musty smell or yellowing pages or a cracked spine or whatever. But in contrast, the digital information is unaltered by passing time or distance traveled. Digital information can travel huge distances and arrive in exactly the same condition that it was sent. It can sit on a storage device for months or years, and when it's recalled, it'll look exactly the same. So if I send an email to a friend in Australia, it'll take exactly the same time to arrive there as an email to my colleague on the other side of the office. And the contents will be completely unaffected by the journey that it's traveled. And that death of distance contributes to what David Weinberger describes as the rise of the miscellaneous. And Ted Nelson calls the deep intertwingling of digital information. When the context is lost, a lot of the significance and nuance of the communication goes with it. All digital interaction has a tendency to strip out context. If we were meeting together in a room in Macclesfield, you would be able to tell whether or not I was wearing anything from the waist down, for instance. Now, you can't. In his book, Lost Icons, Rowan Williams says, what happens to our sense of the human when it's divorced from a grasp of the self as something that's realized in time? Surely what we mean when we talk about post-truth is that we're giving weight to information that isn't connected to embodied reality in time and space, information that has a life of its own. Information that's miscellanised like this allows for multiple randomized connections and a far richer possibility of interrelationship, but it also challenges theological notions about the ordering of the universe and the notion of personhood. And it does that in in a couple of different ways, at least. The first is that in the digital context, there's no ontological difference between a thing and its label. Both exist only as a string of symbols. And that's got profound implications, for instance, for the ownership of information, including information that we previously described as private. David Weinberger again says, get rid of the idea that there's a best way of organizing the world. But if that includes breaking down the distinction between the creator of a cultural artifact, like a blog or a song or an image or a text message, between the creator and the artifact itself, then we've lost the crucial distinction between subject and object. It becomes easier to objectify a human being when they're digitally represented than it is in their physical presence. Another challenge lies in the flattening of relationships in the digital context. Where artifacts are represented in code rather than in physical reality, no one object has any more cultural heft, if you like, than any other. A line of code representing the DNA of a human being is virtually indistinguishable from that of a fruit fly, or for that matter, from a line of code representing the graphical representation of that human being. When we're talking to someone face to face, we're not only listening to the words they say, we're doing something much richer and more complex than that. We're hearing and interpreting the language they're using, picking up physical vibrations, decoding and interpreting them on the basis of our learned experience. And then another part of our brain does another further decoding job, and it interprets those words, gives them a series of meanings, strings them together, makes sentences and paragraphs to make a kind of sense. And at the same time, we're understanding in a much wider context of history and geography, and all of that information that we get in person adds layers of meaning to the encounter between two people. If the engagement is digital, almost all of that essential information is stripped away. That's why it's so easy for us to misunderstand the tone or the meaning of an email or a text message. Digital space and time are different from Cartesian physical space and time in some really significant ways. I'll just mention three differences. First is proximity. In physical space and time, some things are nearer than others, and some people are too. If you go into Tesco's, the sweets are at the front and the milk is at the back. But in digital space and time, every artifact's equally close or equally distant. If you go shopping at Tesco online, the milk and the sweets and everything else are all equidistant. I can get a tweet from the President of the United States right next to one from my best friend. Distance, context has gone. And the second difference between Cartesian space and time and digital space and time is what you might call positional uniqueness. Physical objects can only be in one place at a single moment. In digital space, though, an artifact doesn't have to be restricted to a single location or a single time. In a library, for instance, each book belongs in a particular place on the shelf, thanks to Dewey. And the catalogue tells you how you're going to find it. But that's a limiting factor, because if you've got a book on the history of cooking, you have to decide whether to file it under cookery or history. But the digital version of the book can be catalogued under cookery and history and saucepan and mustard and anything else according to how you like to tag it. And the third distinction between Cartesian space and time and digital space and time is the distribution of coordinates. Physical space is shared, so that every artifact has distinct coordinates in relation to every other artifact and in relation to the whole. And as a result, we have neighbors and other objects that belong with them. And they also have history, they have mortality built into them. But in digital space and time, the relative positioning of an object is meaningless. And this has real significance in things like politics, for instance, which we've always organized on a geographical basis up to now. Or church life, you're the bishop of X or the vicar of Y place for a particular time. But in digital space, the subject of an action is at the center of every map. When you open a map in digital space, it opens around you. You no longer have the option of being on the left or the right. Wherever you are, you're at the center of the world. Now, I'm just going to mention some of the consequences of the collapse of context, and then I'm going to offer a little bit of theological reflection on it, and then perhaps we can have a talk together. One of the contexts is replicability. A digital artifact can be replicated any number of times without any loss of information. So no digital artifact has a permanent claim to uniqueness. And perversely, really, that replicability keeps the digital artifact from having traction in the world of things. Because what makes something real, as Jaron Lanier points out, what makes something real is that it's impossible to reproduce it to completion. And that applies to people too, and representations of people. It would be wonderful to take a convincing artificial representation of my wife on my travels with me. But isn't it important to her humanity that she's only in one place at one time? So replicability is a consequence of the collapse of context. Secondly, I've mentioned relative value. The overall effect of the collapse of context is that levels of order become conflated. There's no difference in significance between a thing and its label, between stuff and data. Artifacts are made of the same stuff as their metadata, and in turn, they are indistinguishable from digitized records of those artifacts. And that's got huge implications when we consider the nature of human personhood and its representation in the digital environment. Just one little example. There's a debate about whether ancient archaeological sites that are found in the wrong location, as in somebody wants to put a motorway there, whether those ancient archaeological sites can simply be precisely recreated in a more convenient place. Well, what if we do that with people too? Since uninterpreted digital artifacts consist of the same stuff, and that stuff has no significant physical presence, they've got no relative value. No object or action can claim to have any greater cultural heft than any other. And the implication of that is that there's no distinction in value between an artificial person and any other digital thing. And then I want to mention another consequence, and that is perishability. It's in the nature of matter that physical things are finite, physical abilities are finite, things fall apart. In contrast, at least in principle, digital information is virtually imperishable. If a CD becomes unplayable, it's because of the corruption of the object or the redundancy of the machinery that plays it. The information itself is intangible, so whilst it may become useless, it isn't subject to any kind of decay. One of the fundamental drivers of digital culture is an attempt to overcome death and decay. When technologists are enthusing with us about the creation of android robots that can have sex with you, none of them are excited about creating a robot that can have sex with you like a 60-year-old man does. The excitement is because digital culture promises eternal youth. But Christian theology celebrates death. Death, which is followed not by the survival of the intelligence, but by the resurrection of the body. And then the last thing that I want to mention as a result of the collapse of context is changing the meaning of ownership. Historically, ownership of information has been linked to the stuff on which the information was carried, a book or a photograph or an item of clothing or a CD. But in a digital culture, the object itself loses significance compared to the information that's stored on it. Digital culture significantly complicates notions of ownership, not least of intellectual property, such as ideas or music. Music in digital form, for instance, can be repeated, sampled, edited, mashed up by people other than its original composer in ways that were unimaginable in a pre-digital age. Commercial and political interests here are highly significant. So the information that Tesco collects from my club card is of huge commercial value to them. Tesco even know how I vote, not because they asked me, but because they know that I buy The Guardian and Fair Trade bananas, so they can have a pretty good guess. The UK government is currently tracking the whereabouts and the spending habits of all asylum seekers by the simple device of offering them welfare payments on cards that can only be used in certain supermarkets. So if an asylum seeker buys a packet of cigarettes or a pregnancy test, the Home Office knows about it. And the Department for Work and Pensions is currently trialling the use of benefit cards for welfare payments. So it's nonsense to talk about being human in a digital culture without recognizing that there are huge commercial and political interests at play, interests that go far beyond the boundaries of states, interests that make geographical states increasingly irrelevant. Now, I just want to make a few reflections on this as we come towards some questions. If we can create a machine that acts and reacts in every way like a human being, why can't we take it one step further? Why can't we create a machine that does what humans can do, only better? Perhaps we should regard the digital age as just a stage of development that can and will be superseded. Professor Martin Rees says, is it not reasonable to think of human beings as the end of anything? When a human being and a machine combine, perhaps they can produce something that's greater, something that we should regard as post-human. Is our bodily form and expression as a human a given, or are we called to bring our humanness on towards some kind of greater state? Theology after Darwin has been concerned with whether there's an ontological difference between apes and human beings. Are we distinct from our evolutionary ancestors? But now we need to project the question forward. Are we so sure that the embodied forms that we know today represent the zenith of evolution? Perhaps, must a person be human? Must a person be biological? Those were real questions for the delegates at the International Congress on Love and Sex with Robots. Is adultery with a robot different from adultery with a human being? One or two reflections in a more theological direction. Christians have often posed a false dualism between the digital and the physical, or what they sometimes call the real, and that's dominated a lot of pastoral thinking about digital technology. We've warned people about the dangers of spending too much time in the virtual environment at the expense of time in the real world and families and physicality and things. But of course, the virtual world is the real world. It's created and tangible and physical. Every expression of ourselves in digital form stems from a physical flesh and blood human being. And it's the reintegration of the virtual and the physical that ought to concern us pastorally and politically. Dr. Karen O'Donnell, she says, when disembodiment is touted as a result of digital technology, what is happening is a failure to recognize embodiment. If Christians reject digital presence as being other than or in competition with immanent presence, then we'll have created yet another false dichotomy. Of the many ways in which the collapse of context engages or challenges Orthodox Christian theology, the doctrine of God and the doctrine of humanity are the most relevant to our discussions. Christian theology speaks of a God who created the universe from disembodied information of God's word. a materially creative God who made matter out of no matter. It's as if God created both the CD and the music, matter as well as information, dust as well as downloads, and determined that they're good. So God is not unfamiliar with disembodiment, but is fully engaged in the materiality of creation. Specifically, God exercises particularity in space and time through God's incarnation in Christ. Jesus came at the right time and to a physical place, the so-called scandal of particularity. And Jesus remains incarnate in the specifics of the living church. And from this emerges the belief that salvation history is linear, in contrast to digital culture in which nothing is particular and no atoms have any more significance than any other. And Christian theology speaks of human beings as particular within creation, both in relation to other material creatures and also in relation to non-materiality. We're distinguished as individuals who are aware of our presence in space and time, and also aware of our presence in the space and the time of independent others. So materiality and presence are fundamental to Christian life. We're to love our neighbour, not only, but at least our geographical and temporal neighbour. For whoever doesn't love their brother and sister who they have seen cannot love God whom they've not seen. A digital artifact isn't even able to recognize its own inadequacy or its dependence on an independent other, because a digital artifact becomes one with any other artifact with which it communicates. Ask Alexa, "Do you love me?" And it will have nothing to say. Of course it doesn't love, because it doesn't have the capacity to be loved and all that goes with it, to be vulnerable, to feel pain, to long for a better future, to call out to God. Of course, there's any number of practical and pastoral challenges here. How will a church that's constructed entirely around geography cope in an age when non-geographical communities are the norm? How will a church that's almost entirely driven by text communicate in an age when the symbol is king? What does the religion of the incarnation have to say to a culture that relativizes the human body? The great challenge of the digital age is the distinction between someone and something. Perhaps the theological category that's relevant here is idolatry. Digital personas are constructs. A machine may look intelligent, it may even look affective or emotional, but its intelligence is artificial or synthetic. We already have theological categories for what it means to make ourselves subject to what we ourselves have made. But whilst the church obsesses about other things that we do with our bodies, we're allowing some fundamental challenges to the ontological status of the human body to go almost unobserved. We seem to be accepting the idea that personhood is just an attribute of humanity, something that we have, rather than something that we are. To paraphrase George Orwell in closing, all the creatures outside looked from machine to person, and from person to machine, and from machine to person again. But already it was impossible to say which was which. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Andrew. And there's been a few streams of discussion that have come up in the chat. So let's have a look at what people have been asking. First of all, we have, does technology really make the decisions for us, or does it change the decisions that we have to make?
Yeah, that's very much what I was suggesting on based on Jaron Lanier, who feels that we are subsuming ourselves to what technology can do for us, and to some extent we've always done that, but that's an issue that we need to look at, and all the more when digital culture becomes so universal.
Thank you. And there was a discussion on the differences between information, morality, sentience, and mortality. And I guess your talk was primarily focused on too much information. I don't know if you want to comment a little bit more on where that leads into concepts of morality and sentience and mortality.
I guess it comes to one of the questions that I'm sure Christians in Science deals with again and again and again, which is, should we do what we can do? I'm sure that comes up in a thousand contexts, and now we're in an even bigger field of that. I have an anxiety that our Christian leaders aren't really dealing with that, because they're still dealing with some of the should we do what we can do questions from 20 years ago.
I think that is probably a valid point, and something that we all need to think about and think through. You mentioned information revolution, and we have an attendee question. Floridi talks about the information revolution, and revolutions are rarely a global event. Kuhn's paradigm shift model might be a better way of viewing the societal changes. I don't know if you're keen on paradigm shifts. Scientists certainly talk about.
It is true that the digital change, the digital shift, has been uneven. There are revolutions, even in a UK context, even in a small context like this, the change has been uneven. And one of the indicators of that has been that during the pandemic, when a lot of education has moved online, some people in our culture have thrived on that, and that's been absolutely fine, and they've had the gear and they've had the Wi-Fi connections. Some people haven't. Lo and behold, people who are poor have done worse when education went digital than people who are wealthy. Well, who'd have thought it? And you can obviously you can scale that up on a global scale as well. Digital technology has been wonderful in some international cultures. I have some connections in Uganda, and farmers in Uganda, vanilla farmers or cocoa farmers, used to have to take their crop to the market and haggle in person as to who would give them the best price for it. Now, with mobile phone technology, they phone around and see which market to go to give them the best price. So it's wonderful, but it's uneven. Try selling those benefits to people who live in remote parts of China or India. So that doesn't quite answer about paradigm shift, but it's uneven. If there is a revolution, it's uneven, and those who are benefiting are tending to be those who benefit in analog culture.
And again, pursuing this idea of revolution, Carol has sent an email. You speak of persistence of cultural structures and therefore no digital revolution. How is the digital culture affecting these structures? Is it creating potential for instability, as you suggest, or can it be used to create more equitable systems?
The problem with digital culture to create more equitable systems is human nature. And human nature and human sinfulness hasn't changed. The wheel could probably have been used for equitable systems, but human nature stepped in, and it didn't. The first industrial revolution could have created more equitable systems. Sadly, it didn't. The problem remains the problem that we had before, the problem of the human heart.
And so often that's where it comes back to, and the way of solving that problem.
Christian Science has been onto the right questions for a very long time. You just have to keep trying to answer them in a new context, in a new area, which I know you do.
So another attendee question. In what way is the hope of resurrection different from the roboticist's hope for digital replicability and eternal youth?
The Christian hope of resurrection includes the hope of bodily resurrection and the hope of time spent in relationship with God. A digital replica of me will not, and heaven help us, I hope not, but if there's somebody creates a digital replica of me, it won't have a relationship with God. It won't have a presence in the life of God. You could, in principle, you could download a person's brain and, in principle, I suppose, a person's whole body into a replica that was entirely kind of digitally indistinguishable, but it would be a machine and I am a person, and I, in my embodied state, will spend eternity with God, and it would not. It and I are so, the distinction is so important between it and I, which is why I'm very nervous about the language that we very quickly use about machines. We quickly give them genders, for example. So Alexa is a she, but if you don't like Alexa being a she, you can change it to he, but we give it a gender, and we say that a computer is learning or deciding or even playing. Computers cannot learn or decide or play, all of which are human things. Computers can't even really compute. It's not to put them down. They're very, very clever, but it's the humans that are clever. Computers are sophisticated. We have to be very careful with our language. Can a robot dance? Of course a robot can't dance. A robot can do something that looks like a human being dancing.
So just moving on, so as we haven't got much more time, we started moving away from geographic church with the development of the car. Many people no longer go to their local church in favour of somewhere across the town, which better suits them. But I'd sort of add to that, I think there has been a geographic shift away from locality, in that someone like me, until last year, spent most of the work day away from where I live in a different place.
Yeah.
And if anything, the pandemic has actually forced some relocalization and forced certainly my church to focus more on its local parish, because people are there more than they used to be. But that's a temporary thing, perhaps.
It is interesting, isn't it? There has been that effect. I think we've got to know our neighbours, our geographical neighbours, probably better during lockdown than we did before. I'm quite sure how that happened, but it did. But having said that, the thrust is all the other way. The thrust is toward communities of interest rather than communities of geography. So whereas the questioner is right, the church used to be changed with the development of the car, probably changed with the development of the horse before that, I don't know. But instead of going to the local church, the one down the road, we go to the one that suits us because we like its worship or its minister or its whatever. Or now we go to the one online that suits us. And that is a problem. My sense is that Christians need to reassert the significance of time and geography, and that we need to, if I could probably find a church for bald-headed Stockport County supporters. Maybe not a church, but maybe a house group. And we could we could relate our faith to our common interests. I'm not sure that would be a clever thing to do, because although we gain something from that, we lose something from the loss of geography and temporality. And I have a hunch that God is teaching us that, actually, and that what is big and powerful and distant about the church is declining, and that what we may see, hopefully, in the grace of God, is what is small and local and powerless growing.
I think there's a lot to hope for in that. So we need to finish, but very quickly, one final email that perhaps picks that up. You mentioned technology making the disadvantaged increasingly disadvantaged. Is this inevitable? How can we optimize the opportunities for the disadvantaged? And how can we mitigate the difficulties?
That's a brilliant, challenging question for Christians. Surely our priority is to optimize the opportunities for the disadvantaged. There is digital technology is producing some fantastic advances for people who are physically disadvantaged because of disability. There's huge potential in that. At the moment, though, it's all going to people who are fantastically wealthy because it's all hugely expensive. Maybe in the same way that Christians 100 years ago, 150 years ago, were teaching people to read because it empowered them, maybe we need to be teaching digital literacy in our churches and providing people with access to information that is untrammeled by advertising, for instance, a purity of information. Maybe we need to be the people who say, who are digitally enabling the digitally disadvantaged. I haven't heard that being spoken about really in any church context.
I think that gives us all something to think about. So thank you very much indeed. It's been a pleasure having you. Thank you for kicking off this morning with a great start. So we'll all rejoin through the next link at 11 o'clock for our next talk. But thank you again, Andrew.
Thank you.